it's no, you rest up for some.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see you.
Can we go ahead?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We'll go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start. So, classification of glaucoma and ocular anomalies. Basically, glaucoma is classified into two types of glaucoma, which is an angle closure glaucoma and an open angle glaucoma. We'll go to the angle closure glaucoma first. So when you come to angle closure glaucoma, you have a primary angle closure disease wherein iridotrabecular contact is the final common pathway of angle closure disease, hence obstructing the aqueous outflow, and it can be conceptualized in two complementary schemes. Depending upon the natural history, or commonly as we know it, ISGEO classification, primary angle closure suspect, primary angle closure, and primary angle closure glaucoma. The details of every individual thing we will come back again. Second concept is to have a anterior segment mechanism of closure. So it could be either a iris pupil obstruction, which is a pupillary block, or a plateau iris syndrome, which is a ciliary body anomaly, or you could also have a lens block or a phacomorphic block, which is a lens pupillar block. Then we have the secondary angle closures. The first among is the anterior pulling mechanism, wherein the iris is pulled forward by some process of the angle, often by the contraction of the membrane or peripheral anterior synechia. The examples being the neovascular glaucoma, iridocorneal endothelial syndromes, posterior polymorphous dystrophy, epithelial downgrowth, fibrous ingrowth, flat anterior chamber, inflammation, penetrating keratoplasty, and iridia. Posterior pushing mechanism, here the iris is pushed forward by some condition in the posterior segment. Often the ciliary body is rotated anteriorly, allowing the lens to come forward also. Examples here are ciliary block glaucoma or the malignant glaucoma, which now is not, this terminology is not used much. So ciliary block glaucoma, cysts of iris and ciliary body, intraocular tumors, nanophthalmos, suprachoroidal hemorrhage, intravitreal air injection or retinal pneumopexy, ciliochoroidal effusions because of panretinal photocoagulation or by any other cause, which is usually because of either inflammation or could be because of a central retinal vein occlusion also. Then scleral buccal procedure and retrodental fibroplasia. The second thing is the primary open angle glaucoma. Herein you can divide it into ocular hypertension, POEG suspect, POEG, that is primary open angle glaucoma, or a normal tension glaucoma or a low tension glaucoma. JOAG I have kept along with this for the convenience of discussion, but JOAG essentially is a developmental type of a glaucoma. Then you have the secondary open angle glaucoma, wherein you have pigment dispersion glaucoma, then the steroid glaucomas, lens-induced glaucomas, which could be again the phacolytic glaucoma, lens particle glaucoma, or a phacoanaphylactic glaucoma. Glaucoma after cataract surgery, again, chymotrypsin is no more common. It was in the ICC era. Now you have glaucoma with viscoelastics, glaucoma with pigment dispersion and intraocular lens, UGH syndrome, which is a uveitis plus glaucoma plus hypema, commonly seen in the rigid PMMA lenses or even with acrylic lenses where the haptics are in the sulcus. Glaucoma after Nd:YAG laser posterior capsulotomy, glaucoma with vitreous in anterior chamber. Then you have glaucoma after trauma, which can be chemical burns, electric shock, radiation, penetrating injury, or contusion injury. Glaucoma associated with intraocular hemorrhages, which could be ghost cell glaucoma, red cell glaucoma, hemolytic glaucoma, or a hemosiderosis. Glaucoma associated with retinal detachment, glaucoma after vitrectomy, and glaucoma with uveitis. Glaucoma with uveitis, you have Fuchs, heterochromic iridocyclitis, glaucomatocyclitic crisis, Koshner-Schwarzman syndrome, precipitates on trabecular meshwork, which is the trabeculitis, herpes simplex or herpes zoster, which is also known as hypertensive uveitis. Then you have sarcoidosis, JRA, syphilis, and HIV-associated uveitis. Glaucoma with intraocular tumors could be because of malignant melanomas, metastatic lesions, leukemia and lymphoma, benign lesions, example, juvenile xanthogranuloma or neurofibromatosis. Then you have amyloidosis, increased episcleral venous pressure, which again could be 3, obstruction of the vena cava, arteriovenous fistula, example is a caroticocavernous fistula, or ocular episcleral venous anomalies, example, Sturge-Weber syndrome. We'll come to this later. Then in the developmental glaucoma, you have a primary congenital glaucomas and a secondary glaucomas. Amongst the primary congenital glaucoma, you can divide them into congenital glaucoma, autosomal dominant juvenile glaucoma, glaucoma associated with a systemic abnormalities, and glaucoma associated with ocular abnormalities. Secondary glaucomas, you have traumatic glaucomas, glaucoma with intraocular neoplasm, uveitic glaucoma, lens-induced glaucomas, glaucoma after cataract surgery, steroid-induced glaucoma, neovascular glaucoma, secondary angle closure glaucoma, and glaucoma with elevated episcleral venous pressure, and glaucoma secondary to intraocular infection. Now, all my this previous classification slides are from Becker-Schaeffer and a few inputs from Shields. Let's go on to the angle closure disease. Firstly, the concept of occludable angle. This was defined as angle in which posterior trabecular meshwork is not visible at least for 270 degrees of the circumference of the eye in primary gaze without indentation with the thinnest slit beam of 1 millimeter height. You have a concept of acute angle closure glaucoma attack, which was not included in the classification. Here, the IOP-induced corneal edema would be present, and it is experienced by patient as a blurred vision and multicolored halos around the light, vascular congestion and pain. This may be accompanied by nausea and vomiting. Patient also has congestion of the eye, corneal edema, vertically mid-dilated pupil, and a very high IOP. Coming to the working classification or the ISGEO. ISGEO is basically International Society for Geographical and Epidemiological Ophthalmology. It defines 3 stages in the natural history of the angle closure disease, which is a PACS, PAC, and PACG. Essentially a primary angle closure suspect, primary angle closure, and a primary angle closure glaucoma. Now, PAC suspect is wherein you have 270 degrees of iridotrabecular contact, no peripheral anterior synechiae, normal optic disc, and normal visual fields. This is also called as an angle at risk. So on gonioscopy, you find that the angles are critically narrow with more than 270 degrees of iridotrabecular contact, but rest everything is normal. Second is a PAC, wherein more than 270 degrees of iridotrabecular contact is present. Could be plus or minus pass, increased IOP plus or minus, no optic disc and visual changes. So basically angle is abnormal in structure or function, but still there is no compromise on the optic nerve function in terms of the structure and the function. Third stage is the primary angle closure glaucoma, wherein more than 270 degrees of iridotrabecular contact is present, plus or minus pass, plus or minus increase in the IOP, optic nerve and visual field damage is established. Angle is abnormal in structure and function along with an optic neuropathy. So this is primary angle closure glaucoma. Then you also have a mechanism-based classification, which is pupillary block, a plateau-arrays, a lens-induced angle closure, and a retrolental mechanism. We'll come to those. There are multiple risk factors, like females are more at risk. It is more of a sporadic, shallow ACs and narrow angles, more common in relatives having family history of glaucoma. Refractive error, more common in hyperopes, more common in winter months, increased curvature of anterior lens surface, increased thickness of the lens, and more in anterior insertion of iris into the ciliary body. Precipitating factors are dim illumination, emotional stress, drugs like anticholinergic drugs, botulinum toxin, adrenergic agents, and when you have patients on long-term pilocarpine or myotics. Symptomatologically, we have discussed acute angle closure glaucoma. They will present with pain, redness, blurred vision. Subacute, no recognizable symptoms, but there could be a dull aching pain around the brow or the head, blurring of vision, and occasional colored halos. Chronic angle closure glaucoma is usually asymptomatic. Clinical findings, as we discussed earlier, you have a vertically mid-dilated pupil with corneal edema, pain, circumcorneal congestion could be present in acute attack. And the other forms, you could have a shallow anterior chamber, mid-dilated pupil, closed angles on gonioscopy, and constricted visual fields. Signs or sequelae of angle closure attack are you could have an iris atrophy, peripheral anterior synechiae, posterior synechiae to lens, glaucom fleccans, which are the white opacities on the anterior lens capsule because of the acute attack, wherein the pupillary sphincter is causing an ischemic attack on the anterior capsular cells, and then they manifest in terms of an opacity. You also would have an optic nerve cupping and a pallor and a visual field loss. Gonioscopy is obviously very, very important here. And what is ideal is an indentation gonioscopy using any of the 4-mirror gonioscope, either a Sussman Zeiss or a Costner's. Acceptable could be a Goldman single or 2-mirror lens with manipulation, but in a beginning step, yes, but slowly, eventually, everyone should move on to a 4-mirror indentation gonioscopy. Schaeffer's system of grading is preferable because it is a descriptive this thing, and the most important thing is the most posterior part which is seen on the angle. So it tells about the degree of openness of the angle, and it also correlates with the von Herix grading of the angle. So if you can see only the corneal slit without a Schwalbe's line, it is grade 0. If you can see a Schwalbe's line, it is grade 1. If you can see a trabecular meshwork, it is grade 2. Scleral spur is grade 3, and ciliary body is grade 4. So even when you document the change of document the gonioscopy findings, in each quadrant you can just mention the posterior most structure which is seen in the gonio, and that would be descriptive classification of the gonioscopy. Mechanism is the opposition contact between the peripheral iris and the posterior trabecular meshwork caused because of the pupillary block. It results in blockage of the trabecular outflow, which with intermittent increase in IOP, and permanent synechial closure of the angle with chronic rise of IOP will ensue at a later time. The second part is the plateau iris. The small percentages have an angle closure from plateau iris mechanism. It's basically an anteriorly positioned ciliary process place where peripheral iris in contact with the trabecular meshwork. You can also see a peripheral roll or a bump in the iris, which causes the opposition to the cornea and then cause a rise in the IOP. As against to a pupillary block mechanism of a primary angle closure, you have no forward bowing of central or a mid-peripheral iris as seen in pupillary block. Now we come to the open angle glaucoma. You have OHT, POAG suspect, POAG, NTG, and then JOAG. OHT is a condition wherein the IOP is more than 21 millimeters of mercury on 2 consecutive occasions with normal optic disc, normal visual fields, and open angles associated with absence of any ocular or systemic disorders contributing to elevated IOP. Clinical features are you have an elevated IOP, open angles, normal optic disc, and normal visual fields. Treatment is basically governed by the OHTS. Basically, you need to decide whether it requires a treatment or no treatment on OHTS guidelines. And if the patient is on treatment, the follow-up will be as per the POAG patient. And if the patient is on observation, then you need to do at least once in a year perimetry and or OCT and follow-up. Coming to the POAG suspect is a condition with clinical findings or risk factors that increase the likelihood of developing POAG. It could have a consistently elevated IOP, appearances of the disc and the retinal nerve fiber layer that is suspicious of glaucomatous damage, or a visual field change defect is suspicious of glaucomatous damage but not confirmed. You need to repeat it at least at 2 intervals and confirm that it is a established glaucomatous damage, and only if it is correlating with the structural damage in terms of the fundus photo or OCT, then you can ascertain that it's a glaucoma, or else it still remains as a glaucoma suspect under evaluation. Investigation, most of the things remains the same. Follow-up also could be once in a year or could be once in 6 to 12 months, depending upon the risk factors. So if they have a family history, if their CCTs are thin, if they have a relatively higher IOPs, you could have earlier frequency of testing, maybe 4 to 6 months. Otherwise, you could have a yearly follow-up. PUAG is defined as a chronic progressive anterior optic neuropathy characterized by acquired loss of retinal ganglion cell loss, visual field loss, and open angle with no obvious causative ocular or a systemic condition. So basically, it has to be a diagnosis of exclusion. You have to see that there is no other cause causing the rise in the pressure, and then you ascertain that it is a primary open angle glaucoma. Clinical features, you have elevated IOP, evidence of optic nerve head damage in terms of an optic nerve head, nerve fiber layer damage. Then you could have a diffuse loss, you could have a progressive thinning of NRR, focal peripapillary loss, peripapillary splinter hemorrhages. And in terms of visual field, you have a reliable and a reproducible visual field abnormality. There are various visual field abnormalities to start with nasal step and slowly sedal scotoma and arcuate and double arcuate and paracentral. The treatment or the follow-up of PUAG depends on the severity of the glaucoma. You could divide it into mild, moderate, severe, either depending upon the level of the visual field damage, 6 diopter, 12 diopters and above, and more than 18 diopters. Accordingly, you could follow up every 6 months or 4 months, or very advanced cases, even every 2 or 3 months, you can do the perimetry test for them. And you have the entity called normal tension glaucoma or low tension glaucoma. Here, the primary optic neuropathy characterized by statistically normal range IOP less than 21 millimeters of mercury with optic disc cupping and associated retinal nerve fiber loss, and visual field defects consistent with the appearance of ONH with open anterior chamber. Clinical features here are commonly you see senile sclerotic disc, focal ischemic damage, myopic glaucomatic disc, or a generalized enlargement of optic disc. Patterns of visual field loss are little particular to this disease is that early dense visual field defect extending to within 5 degrees of fixation could be seen, early involvement or threatening of fixation, and slow progression of the disease. Investigation particular to NTG is systemic medical history is important. Nocturnal hypotension, you could do a Holter BP monitoring for this. Diurnal IOP monitoring is important. Pachymetry is important to not consider or not wrongly diagnose it as NTG, or which otherwise could be a PUAG. Pachymetry so has to be done in every case of a glaucoma. Assessment of ONH blood flow could be done. VFA 10-2 to be included in every testing of a suspected NTG patient. Systemic investigations like a CT or a MRI brain, blood investigations to regarding the blood coagulation profile, including the homocystinuria, carotid diseases, carotid studies, and sleep apnea studies. For NTG, you need to again divide or categorize them into a progressive or a non-progressive. Only when you follow up very closely and repeat the perimetries often, you can categorize them in either into a progressive or a non-progressive. If it's a non-progressive, then follow up every 6 months and visual field and ONH could be done every 12 months. If it is a progressive, then like an PUAG, you could do every 4 to 5 months. Then coming to the juvenile open angle glaucoma, it's a rare juvenile onset open angle glaucoma often found associated with myopia that shows autosomal dominant transmission. Clinical features, it's seen in early onset. The age could be from 3 years to 40 years. Anything between 3 to 40 years and having developmental changes, label it as a juvenile open angle glaucoma. Very high intraocular pressures at presentation is very common in this JOAGs. ONH damage in corresponding visual field changes similar to POAG, strong family history of glaucoma, and hence family screening is important. Commonly associated in myopes, and corneoscopy often has open angles with prominent iris processes. So this prominent iris processes is pretty important for JOAG. Investigation, most of them are similar except for the family history. So you need to do a screening of family members for early detection, and a genetic testing for the mutational analysis of myocilin gene could also be done. Treatment algorithm mostly remains the same except that JOAG usually is not a medical condition. Very few percentages of JOAG are well controlled with medical management, and they usually require surgical intervention, more so because they are presenting at a very advanced stage. So that completes our primary open angle and the primary angle closure glaucoma. Now we go to the secondary glaucomas. Secondary glaucomas are the glaucoma associated with other ocular and systemic disorders. Classification could be based on the initial events, like the disorders of the corneal endothelium, disorders of the iris and ciliary body, and disorders of the lens. So in corneal endothelium, you have ICE syndromes, iridocorneal endothelial syndrome, posterior polymorphous dystrophy, or a Fuchs endothelial dystrophy. Disorders of the iris and ciliary body, you have pigmentary glaucomas, iridochiasis, plateau iris, or iris and a ciliary body cyst. And disorder of the lens, you could have a pseudoexfoliation syndrome, glaucoma associated with cataract, glaucoma associated with lens dislocation. Then you have disorders of the retina and choroid and vitreous, which is a neovascular glaucoma, glaucoma associated with RD and VR surgeries. Intraocular tumors could be malignant melanoma, retinoblastoma, metastatic carcinomas, leukemias, and lymphomas, and benign tumors. Elevated episcleral venous in terms of carotid cavernous fistula and Sturge-Weber syndrome. Inflammation, glaucoma associated with uveitis or glaucoma associated with keratitis, episcleritis, scleritis. This classification could also be based on the initial events which to add to the previous list, you could have a steroid-induced glaucoma, ocular trauma, or a hemorrhage-related or intraocular surgery-related glaucoma. Intraocular surgery-related glaucoma again could be a ciliary block glaucoma, glaucoma in pseudophakia and aphakia, epithelial or a fibrous ingrowth, endothelial proliferation, corneal surgery, or vitreoretinal surgery. So I'll first discuss the pathogenesis of how the secondary glaucomas cause increase in the pressure, and then we'll go to the individual important secondary glaucomas. So firstly, it could be a trabeculitis, that is an inflammatory angle damage with secondary mechanical block. Here the leaked plasma proteins from either a leaky vessels or the inflamed iris vessels could go and block the trabecular meshwork and cause an inflammation. Even the inflammatory cells could block the trabecular meshwork and cause a rise in the pressure. And at a later date, it causes sclerosis of the meshwork. Obstruction of the intratrabecular spaces by cellular material, like the macrophages laden with the lens material in paculitic glaucoma, hypema, the red blood cells or the khaki cells, or the macrophages with the hemosiderotic pigments could go and block the glaucoma trabecular meshwork. Invasion by the neoplastic cells could also cause an obstruction of the trabecular meshwork. Obstruction of the outflow system by abnormal extracellular materials, like pigmentary glaucoma, you have pigments of the iris going and blocking the meshwork, pseudoexfoliative glaucoma, or a silicon oil glaucoma. Changes in the metabolic activity of the trabecular meshwork. A classic example is the steroid-induced glaucoma, wherein the proteoglycans, glycosaminoglycans get deposited in the juxta capillary areas, and they cause increased resistance to the outflow of the trabecular meshwork. Then you could have increase in the episcleral venous pressure, which could be a keratoconus fistula. So we'll come down to the secondary angle closure glaucoma. What are the underlying pathological causes? So the synovial angle closure caused by an abnormal new vessels, example is rubiotic or the neovascular glaucoma. Synovial angle closure caused by abnormal epithelial or fibrous downgrowth. Synechial angle closure caused by inflammatory infiltrates in cases of posterior uveitis, or a non-synechial angle closure caused by abnormal lens iris diaphragm anatomy in case of a ciliary body swelling or detachment, or abnormally thick lens and intraocular tumors. So now we come to the individual important secondary glaucomas, secondary open angle glaucomas. First amongst that is the pigment dispersion. Pigment dispersion syndrome and pigmentary glaucomas are the spectrum of this. When you just have the pigments, this thing, and you do not have the raised IOP, it's called as a pigment dispersion. When you have pigment dispersion along with the raised IOP, it is pigment dispersion syndrome. And when this increased IOP goes and damages the optic nerve, then it is labeled as a pigmentary glaucoma. So your two successive stages of the same disease process are the pigment dispersion syndrome and the pigmentary glaucoma. Here you have a disruption of the iris pigment epithelium and the deposition of this dispersed pigment granules throughout the anterior segment. So this is the common triad of signs which are seen in pigmentary glaucoma. You have a reverse bowing of the peripheral iris, you have a transillumination defect of the iris, and you have densely laden pigments in the angle. Pathophysiology is basically concave iris contour that allows the opposition of its posterior surface of the iris to the zonular bundles. These frictions between the zonules and the peripheral iris cause pigment liberation, and they go and block the trabecular meshwork. The exacerbating or the precipitating factor is usually exercise. They give a typical history of having a blurring of vision following an heavy exercise. It could be jogging, it could be playing basketball, bouncing, or proper weight training can cause a release of pigment as a result of pupillary movement. Pharmacologic pupillary dilatation may result in significant pigment revelation in the anterior segment, and this could be also used as a challenge test. This pigment liberation may be accompanied by IOP increase. Commonly seen in young males who are myopes, Caucasians, slight with a strong positive family history. Caucasians, yes, but in Indians also you see pigmentary glaucoma. The only change which is not very commonly seen in Indian eyes because of dense pigmentation is the transillumination defect. But we do come across rarely with those also. In cornea, you have a corneal endothelial pigment which appears as the Krukenbus spindle, which is a central vertical brown band of iris pigment. Loss of iris pigment appears as a mid-peripheral radial slit-like patterns of transillumination defect, difficult to appreciate in dark iris like in Indians. Lens and zonules, you have interrupted lines on the posterior peripheral surface of the lens, which is the Zentmeyer's ring or the Scheie stripe. In angles, you have a wide open angle, heavy dark brown to black pigmentation, and more prominent in the inferior angles. Iris is inserted posteriorly into the ciliary body and has a concave configuration of the peripheral iris. Posterior segment, you could have a lattice degeneration in 20% of patient, retinal plaques in around 11 to 12% patient, and rhegmatogenous retinal detachments requiring surgery may occur in around 3% of patients. Treatment here essentially in the early phases is laser iridotomy, but here proper patient selection is important, and ideally the patient should still be in the pigment liberation stage. Once it has gone into a very advanced glaucoma stage, doing a PI could actually be another insult of pigment release, and it could aggravate a glaucoma, and it could aggravate the IOP spike. In young patients with iris concavity, active release of pigment and ocular hypertension is seen, and laser iridotomy may be benefit for many years to go. So this is an thing showing backward bowing of the iris in pigment dispersion glaucoma, and after the PI is done, it is well corrected, and he may not have pigment dispersions in future, but you have to regularly monitor. Second common one is the PXF glaucoma. The PXF material could be release from the lens surface, from the corneal endothelium, iris epithelial lining, trabecular meshwork, or the posterior capsule. Basically, any structure of the anterior segment which has a epithelium, you could have it released from any of the structures. Here again, you have a classical signs wherein you have three zones on the anterior lens capsule, the central zone of fibrillar material, then a empty zone in the mid periphery, and followed by again a peripheral zone of PXF material. You could also have, you will have usually the moth-eaten appearance of the pupillary border or loss of pupillary ruff. You could see PXF deposit on various other structures like we discussed on the zonules and on the posterior capsule of the lens. Glaucoma is more severe in PXF. You could also have higher untreated IOPs, greater baseline visual loss, and the field loss is also very rapid. Problems in PXF glaucoma is poor mydriasis and zonular dialysis or weak zonules, which can cause a lens dislocation or a capsular rupture. So even with all the efforts, this picture tells it all. There is a CTR, there is a lens, but the whole complex is getting spontaneously dislocated even in the post-operative period, many years following a surgery also. So going on to post-vitreoretinal procedures now. You could have a glaucoma caused because of post-vitrectomy, post-buccal, post-PRP, or a post-IVTA. Coming to the vitrectomy, around 35% of the patients post-vitrectomy develop IOP. And this happens within first 48 hours. Risk factors being PVR, scleral buccal, endolaser, lensectomy done along with a vitrectomy, post-op fibrin membranes, prolonged complicated surgeries, or a pre-existing glaucoma patient who has undergone a vitrectomy. So coming to the classification of glaucoma after vitrectomy, you have pre-existing glaucoma associated with intraocular hemorrhage related to lens matter, neovascular, inflammatory, corticosteroid induced, and intraocular gas or liquid. Now we come to the clinical presentation of this. So depending upon the time of presentation, you could have the various causes. This is important to understand because the treatment varies as according to that. So on day one, the common angle closure glaucomas are because of the expansion of the gases, either a SF6 or a PFCL or C3F8. Suprachoroidal hemorrhage could be the other cause. At 1 week, you have hyphema, ghost cell glaucoma, hemolytic glaucoma, retained lens material with phacolytic glaucoma, uveitis, or a pre-existing glaucoma, even a fibrin pupillary block. So you have a iris form kind of a picture forming because of fibrin membrane in the iris and the pupillary margin. That could be the cause at around 1 week, wherein the inflammation gets organized. Later, at the interval of around 2 to 4 weeks, you have a neovascular glaucoma. If the inflammation is not well controlled, it will eventually lead to formation of the neovascular glaucoma also. Coming down to the silicon oil glaucoma, you have silicon oil causing glaucoma in various forms. You could have an induced pupillary block if it is overfilled. Silicon oil could leak into an anterior chamber and block the trabecular meshwork. Silicon oil bubbles in the trabecular meshwork, which is emulsified bubbles. Pigmented cells and silicone-laden macrophages could go and block the trabecular meshwork and cause an increase in the IOP. Or a emulsified oil in the AC, the small emulsified bubbles could go and block the trabecular meshwork. So these are some clinical scenarios. You have a big bubble of silicone oil in the AC, and in the right you have emulsified small bubbles which have gone and blocked in the angles. You have an inverted hypopyon or a hyporolion in the left side, and you have a silicone oil bubble in the AC in the right side. Coming to the scleral buccal, around 4 to 7% shallowing of AC with raised IOP is seen in scleral buccal. In the B scan, you can see that supra effusion kind of a picture, choroidal effusion kind of a picture post scleral buccal surgery. Here the pathogenesis goes in this manner. Encirclage causes an impaired venous drainage. congested vortex veins, which cause forward shift of the ciliary body, entry displacement of the iris lens diaphragm, and causing a secondary angle closure. The entire lens iris diaphragm is displaced forward. Difference from pupillary block is that there is no iris bombay and the space between the iris and the lens. Management it could spontaneously resolve if you control the associated inflammation. Cycloplegic steroids and anti-glaucoma medications are the mainstay. And if it doesn't respond, you have to go in and do a release of the encirclage. Coming to a very common scenario in today's world is the in post-BR surgeries. They are very diabetic macular edema, uveitis, post-CRVO, PRVO macular edema, post-cataract CME, or simplest of the cause is the visualization of vitreous during the anterior vitrectomy. How long the IVTA will stay in an eye? 0.5 milligram of triamcinolone acetate disappeared rapidly in vitrectomized eye and lensectomized eye within 6.5 days. Only vitrectomy done eyes, it stays for around 16 days. Normal eyes, it stays for around 40 days. So a vitrectomized and a lensectomized aphakic eye is 6.7, vitrectomized only is 16, and a normal eye around 41 days. Glaucoma after triamcinolone acetate. This was the study which showed more than 21 millimeters of mercury was seen in almost 52% of the patients post IVTA injection, and IOP increase was more commonly seen at about 2 months of interval. Young patients and pre-existing glaucoma were the risk factors for increased IOP spike, and IOP normalized by about 6 months without further treatment. So the risk factors are glaucoma or a glaucoma suspect, type 1 diabetic mellitus, first degree relatives of POAG, and high myopias, and even a connective disease. This is how IVTA would look on an IO or even on a slit lamp biomicroscopy. Treatment essentially initially medical management. Once the IVTA gets absorbed, IOP starts to decrease, and you can slowly taper off the anti-glaucoma medication. Very rarely 1 or 2% may have a long-term IOP, uncontrolled IOP, and may require even a surgical treatment. Similarly, you have with the retisert and the fluocinolone acetate pellet. The other forms of steroid-induced glaucomas are the steroids which are used for the VKCs, where you have the tarsal and the supratarsal injections of the IVTs. Coming to the steroid-induced glaucoma, if you can see in here, the general population, high steroid-induced glaucoma is seen only in 5% of the patients, whereas low is around patients of siblings of POAG. These percentages go. In POAG, you have 90%, and in siblings of POAG, you have around 30% of chance. Offsprings also, you have around 20% having a high incidence of steroid response. So the monitoring of IOP post IVT or any form of a steroid treatment is mandatory. Even a topical steroid drops, you have to monitor them for intraocular pressure. If the patients are on systemic steroids, even anything more than 10 milligrams of prednisolone, IOP has to be checked at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and then 6 monthly thereafter. Now, propensity for IOP spike among various molecules goes this way. Difluprednist is the far most notorious among this. You get a very strong and a very long-lasting IOP spike with it. Then you have prednisolone, then dexamethasone, and then the soft steroids, which are the loteprednol and fluorometholone. So once you have a steroid response or a steroid spike, it's always preferable to scale down the strength of your steroid. You can use a milder, softer steroids. Go on to the post PK or penetrating keratoplastic glaucoma. One of the commonest reason for the graft failure is uncontrolled IOP, graft rejection being a very common reason otherwise. Pre-existing glaucoma is always a concern, and that's why it's always preferable to control the pressures first, either medically or by surgical or by implants. Immediate post-operative, the causes could be visco, pigments, vitreous in the AC, or inflammation, or sometimes even a heme in the AC. Graft size disparity could cause angle distortion and could cause peripheral anterior synechia on a longer run. Steroid induced is a common cause in the initial few months. You have to monitor IOP every visit, which is at least once every week till 2 months, and then you can increase the frequency later on. Now we come to the congenital glaucoma. Now, congenital glaucoma is one of my favorites and is close to my heart. Is all the patients that we have treated at Lotus. So we'll go ahead with congenital glaucoma. Congenital glaucoma is broadly classified into primary and secondary. As per the broad consensus series 9 by the World Glaucoma Association, they discourage the use of the traditional terms of developmental glaucoma, congenital glaucoma, or infantile glaucoma, as they lack any clear definition of the cause of the glaucoma over there. This was what was being used earlier. Related to the age of onset, you could have a congenital glaucoma wherein the glaucoma exists at birth and usually before birth. Infantile glaucoma occurs from birth until 3 years of life. Juvenile glaucoma, which occurs from the age of 3 years to 30 years. Then you have classification of developmental glaucoma. This is the clinical classification, and this is what is recommended that you start incorporating in your clinical practice. They divided it into an isolated trabecular dysgenesis, iridodysgenesis, or a corneodysgenesis. So we come down to isolated trabecular dysgenesis. Here you have absence of iris or corneal anomalies. This is very important, and this is the hallmark of a primary congenital glaucoma or a PCG, which they commonly called. Here you could have a flat iris insertion, the variation being an anterior insertion or a posterior insertion or a mixed insertion. You could also have a concave or a wraparound iris insertion, or you could have an unclassified insertion. Coming to the iridodysgenesis, you have trabecular dysgenesis associated with an iris anomalies along with it. So you could have an anterior stromal defect, which is a hypoplasia or hyperplasia, anomalous iris vessels, which is persistence of tunica vascular lentis, abnormal superficial vessels, then the structural anomalies in terms of holes, colobomata, and iridia. Corneal dysgenesis, you have if the corneal anomalies are associated along with trabecular dysgenesis, then it's called as a corneodysgenesis, and you have three Axenfeld. Axenfeld is an example of a peripheral corneal dysgenesis, because you have a mid-peripheral dysgenesis and a central, which is a Peters anomaly or anterior staphyloma. Commonly, you have a common presentation of Axenfeld rigor together. We'll come down to that later. And depending upon the corneal size, you have a macrocornea or a microcornea. The definition of childhood glaucoma by CGRN, which is Childhood Glaucoma Research Network, defines childhood, the age presentation should be less than 16 years. Definition of glaucoma should require two of the following 5 criteria: the IOP more than 21, optic disc cupping, corneal findings of Habs-Striae, corneal edema, or diameter of more than 11 mm in newborn, 12 mm at 1 year, or 13 mm at any age. Progressive myopia or myopic shift coupled with an increase in the ocular dimension, essentially the axial length, out of proportion with the normal growth. So every time you do a EUA, it is prudent to do a axial length by a scan. A reproducible visual deficit with a consistent with glaucomatous optic neuropathy with no other observable reason for visual field defect. Now you will say how a child is supposed to do a visual field. Remember, you just need 2 out of the 5 criteria, and you need not have all. Once the patient is above 4, 5 years or 6 years of age, you can attempt to do a visual field for him. Primary congenital glaucomas, coming down to that, you have 1 in 10,000 live birth, 80% of onset within a year, 25% are congenital. Bilateral in 80%, male preponderance is 3:2 and no racial preponderance. 90% of them are sporadic, 10% familial. Mutation of CYP1B1 risk of 3% is, once the first two are affected, the risk jumps to 25%. So genetic counseling is important over here. Clinical presentation, you have a classic triad of epiphora, photophobia, blepharospasm, and a classic triad of signs of corneal clouding, corneal enlargement, and a progressive axial myopia. Coming to the corneal enlargement, normal corneal diameter is around 9.5 to 10.5. A corneal diameter of more than 12 mm in first year of life is pathognomic, and a more than 13 mm at any age is a good suspicion for a congenital glaucoma. Elevated IOP causes corneal haze that clears on IOP normalization. HAPS striae occurs as the cornea stretches under influence of IOP and causes a break in the testament membrane. Dense corneal stromal opacity despite IOP decrease also could be present in a long uncontrolled congenital glaucoma. HAPS striae are the tear in the testament's membrane, usually oriented horizontally as against to the vertical ones which are seen with forceps delivery, associated with corneal edema and repaired by endothelial overgrowth, but linear opacities do persist. The haziness would go away, but the track appearance always persists. This is the IOP that is seen at birth. It's around 9 to 10, and by around 12 to 16, it stabilizes to around 14 to 15. This is the normal expected IOP. So you could have even a 14 or a 15 or 16 IOP in the case of a congenital glaucoma. In terms of IOP and anesthesia, minimal effect is caused by a chloral hydrate or a midazolam or a oxygen inhalation, nitrous oxide inhalation. Halothane causes mild to moderate reduction, and ketamine and succinylcholine is known to have quite a significant increase in the IOP, even an endotracheal tube intubation. And hence, our practice during UA is to pre-medicate the patient with a midazolam and then perform a mask inhalation induction with oxygen, nitrous oxide, or a sevoflurane. Here, as soon as the patient is pre-medicated, before the intubation happens, you take the IOP with the Perkins, and then the rest of the testing like the horizontal diameter, the CCT, the fundus evaluation, the A scan, everything can be followed after intubation or the laryngeal mask. Coming down to glaucoma associated with non-acquired ocular anomalies, you could have conditions with predominantly ocular anomalies, which may or may not be associated with systemic signs. Axenfeld rigor, Peter, congenital ectropy and UVA, congenital iris hypoplasia, aniridia, persistent fetal vasculature, ocular dermal melanocytosis, posterior polymorphous dystrophy, microphthalmos, microcornea, and ectopia lentis. Similarly, in glaucoma associated with non-acquired systemic disease, you could have connective tissue disorders like Marfan's, Marfan-Marfan, Stickler's, metabolic disorders like homocystinuria, Love syndrome, mucopolysaccharidosis, phacomatosis, Rubinstein-Davy syndrome, congenital rubella, glaucoma associated with acquired conditions which are not inherited or are present at birth, but which develop after birth, which could be like any other glaucoma, like uveitis, trauma, steroideous trauma. ROP is an important cause post-surgery other than cataract surgery. So this is one important topic which I thought we should go around in a short manner is phacomatosis. So this term was coined by van der Hoe. Common phacomatosis which are seen are neurofibromatosis type 1, type 2, tuberous sclerosis, von Hippel-Lindau syndrome, Sturge-Weber syndrome, and Weber-Mason syndrome. So NF type 1, also called as von Reckling-Gossen's disease, neuroectodermal tumors with autosomal dominant inheritance. Men and women are equally affected, no racial predilection. And these are the diagnostic criteria. You should have 6 or more capillary spot, each of 1.5 centimeters or larger in post-pubertal individuals. And in pre-pubertal individual, it has to be could be 0.5 centimeters or larger. 2 or more neurofibromas of any type, or 1 or more plexiform neurofibroma, freckling in the axilla or groin, optic nerve glioma, 2 or more lesh nodules on iris, or distinctive bony lesion, dysplasia of sphenoid bone, dysplasia or thinning of the long bone cortex, or first degree relative with NF type 1. So these are some ocular manifestation, lignous crisis, which is the thickened intrastromal corneal nerves. You could see over here. Then you could have a subcutaneous pedunculated and plexiform neurofibromas, lesh nodules, which are light brown nodules or tan colored nodules that stirred in the iris. It's a dark brown iris in the Indian Asian iris kind of a picture, and a Caucasian iris, they appear in this manner. The cells are normal uveal melanocytes and not nevus cells. Optic nerve gliomas are seen in around 10 to 15% cases. Unilateral or bilateral presence could be seen. Frequently involves optic chiasma. In the orbit, they cause progressive proptosis and optic could also have choroidal nevis and retinal astrocytic hematomas. The possible cause of glaucoma here is infiltration of angle structures or obstruction of the outflow by neurofibroma, closure of angle by forward displacement of the anterior uvea, or a secondary fibrovascular proliferation and closure of filtration by a mechanism by synechiae. This is capsular spots we already discussed, axillary freckles. Coming down to NF2, relatively uncommoner as compared to NF1. 1 person in 40,000 to 50,000 person, bilateral vestibular schwannomas, that is acoustic neuromas, and widely scattered neurofibromas, meningiomas, gliomas, and schwannomas could be present. Ophthalmic findings are relatively uncommon. The combined hematomas of retina in juvenile posterior subcapsular or cortical opacities could be seen. Tuberous sclerosis is a multi-organ tumor syndrome. There are multifocal bilateral retinal astrocytic hematomas, astrocytic tumors of CNS, several unusual cutaneous lesions, mental retardation, seizure, and a variety of cysts and tumors of the other organ, commonly the renal. Okay.
Excuse me, Sushil sir.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Student has lot of questions on the this other classification and everything.
Okay. So what I will do is in just 2 or 3 minutes, I'll just go through the
Okay,
headings,
then we will
and then
go
we'll
to
go
the
on to the discussion.
Yeah, then we'll take up the questions, Sushil, few of them.
Yeah. Just 2 minutes, and I'll cover just the headings part of it.
Okay.
So the other common one is the Sturge-Weber syndrome, which is a dermalo-ocular-neural syndrome. They usually result from an early embryogenic malformation of vascular development. You commonly see a telangiectasia of the conjunctiva and episclera, and could have a flavius nevus flameus, the Port Weinstein kind of an appearance of the thing in the trigeminal nerve area distribution. It's unilateral and it doesn't cross the midline. There could be ipsilateral leptomeningeal hemangiomatosis in the CNS manifestation. You could have seizures and associated mental retardation. It's not very common, so we'll skip this. Wesson-Mason syndrome also, you have typical vascular dilatations like this on this thing, but not very common. The other common one is the corneodysgenesis, wherein you could have a peripheral Axenfeld anomaly, mid-peripheral Axenfeld rigor anomaly, or a central, which is a Peters or a posterior keratoconus or a posterior ulcer of von Hippel. Axenfeld, you have a posterior embryotoxin shown in the left figure and a prominent Schwalbe's line and an abnormal iris processes shown in the right figure. It's an autosomal dominant and 50% have infantile glaucoma. Mid-peripheral or Axenfeld rigor. Commonest ocular anomalies are strabismus, cataract, retinal detachment, optic nerve hypoplasia, and chorioretinal colobomas. Glaucoma is usually seen in first and second decade and associated with trabecular dysgenesis. Axenfeld-Rieger syndrome is when you have Axenfeld-Rieger anomaly associated with the dental findings of hypodentia, microdentia, and malar hypoplasia. Central ones are Peters anomaly, and this usually doesn't have too much of an association with glaucoma. Then you have familial hypoplasia of iris. Aniridia is an important thing. You have a bilateral congenital anomaly. Commonest associated features are limbal stem cell deficiency, iris hypoplasia, foveal hypoplasia, optic nerve hypoplasia. So, congenital rubella syndrome is a classic triad of cardiac abnormality, deafness, and cataract. You have ocular disorders in around 78% of those, sensorineural deficit in around 66%, and mental retardation in around 62%. Other ocular features are keratitis, glaucoma also can also be due to iridocyclitis. Typically have a saltpeter retinopathy and congenital cataracts. Similarly, you have Loeys oculocerebrorenal syndrome with a congenital cataract, renal tubular dysfunction, and a mental retardation. 50% of these cases would usually have a glaucoma. Then you have the other secondary glaucomas, essentially the primary hyperplastic vitreous, retinopathy of prematurity, lens-related tumor trauma, neovascular inflammation, and steroid. So this is another subset, but we'll skip for the want of time. Marfan's and homocystinuria are commonly associated with glaucomas. The differentiating point here is Marfan's, you have an outward and upward dislocation of lens, whereas homocystinuria, you have a downward and a nasal dislocation of the lens. Marfan's being autosomal dominant, associated with triad of skeletal abnormality, aortic dilatation, and ectopia lentis. And homocystinuria, you have dense dislocation, mental retardation, dental abnormality, and arachnodactyly. Spherophakias could be associated with pupillary block. It's an autosomal dominant. Could be a microspherophakia, ectopia lentis, loose zonules, and you have to look for this spherophakia in where you have a high myopia but with a shallow AC. Tumors could be another reason. Eye syndrome is an adult manifestation in around 20 to 30 years of age or 20 to 40 years of age. That's all about it, and thank you. In case someone is not able to catch up to the various this thing, I will be happy to share the presentation and they can go through the presentation.
Will be sharing the entire video on the YouTube, sir, so they can
on the YouTube, yeah,
watch it as many times. We'll take the questions, ma'am.
Yeah. So that was a nice presentation, Sushil. You have covered almost everything. Few queries that have come up. First is phacomorphic glaucoma due to intumescent cataract. Will that be secondary angle closure glaucoma? As in the classification, it is given in primary angle closure. What is your take, Sushil? I think phacomorphic comes in the category of secondary glaucomas, right?
The classic phacomorphic glaucoma which presents to us is because of the hypermature cataract that will come as a secondary glaucoma. But you have phacomorphic glaucomas in cases like ectopia lentis or with spherophakia kind of a lens that could be a primary glaucoma.
Right. So the next is pathophysiology of pain and vomiting due to raised IOP. This I've already answered. So this acute congestive glaucoma causes sympathetic overstimulation, which leads to pain and vomiting and mid-dilated pupil also. Anything else you want to add, Sushil?
No, that I think is fine. It's also when it's an acute rise, it's a stretch of this thing which incites the cascade.
Right. So any role of miotics and prostaglandins in acute angle closure attack?
You don't want to contribute another inflammation there, and hence we usually try and avoid prostaglandins in the initial part. Pilocarpine could be used, but it will come into effect or action only once the IOP is decreased. So you can start concentrating with pilocarpine and decrease the IOP with oral acetazolamide or with mannitol. Once the pressure is relieved and the ischemia is relieved, the pilocarpine will cause constriction of the pupil.
Yeah, because in the acute attack, there is sphincter ischemia. So myotics will have no role on the sphincter at that time till the ischemia is not relieved. The acute attack has not subsided.
Ma'am,
So
just to add a sub question here. So exactly when should we, at which stage we should give myotics in the angle closure glaucoma? Like how will we understand the ischemia is gone? Is it depending on the IOP or the pupillary movement?
So yes, few things. So sometimes see the pupillary dilatation, mid dilatation, secondary to angle closure may remain for a long time, persistent. So the other factors like IOP coming down, corneal edema subsiding, there is no inflammation in the eye, a quiet eye, are all suggestive of the
Reduction.
pupil reduction and the breakage of the acute attack.
So there is no actual contraindication to the use of pilocarpine. It's just that it may not be effective in the initial phase, but you can always use it and concentrate. And when the pressure decreases, it can be of use. Sometimes the pupils do remain mid-dilated, but what you want is the pull on the peripheral iris from the angles, which could be affected by the pilocarpine, and it could contribute to opening of the angles, especially when you are not, the patient is not immediately willing for a laser PI. You can add a pilocarpine in terms of buying a day or two.
Right. So there is one question that some articles say the iridotrabecular contact of more than 180 degree is the definition of PACS. So it is not like that. We have to quote ISGO as he clearly mentioned. Sushil has clearly mentioned that classification says that iridotrabecular contact of more than 270 degree is suggestive of PACS. That's right, Sushil?
Yes, the definitions have changed. Initially, the conservative dissemination of occludable angle was having more than 180 degrees, but the observation of it not leading into an angle closure was pretty common. The percentage which was with 180 degrees, not many were going into angle closure, and so now ISGO has come up with 270 degrees.
Right. Role of PI in plateau iris syndrome. I think this is quite interesting. We can have a separate discussion on plateau iris syndrome and plateau iris configuration. Would you like to answer that, Sushil? Or?
Yes. So plateau iris configuration and plateau iris syndrome. Once you have a raised IOP, it's an essential requirement to lead to a diagnosis. Unless you have done a PI and the IOP has not normalized or the configuration of the angles has not changed, you will not be in a position to label it, confirm that it is a plateau iris syndrome. So the classic description or the guidelines that they say is that you have to do two at a diagonally opposite areas or far away areas, and even after that, if the pressures are not falling down, then you can go ahead and consider other treatments like iridotrabeculoplasty and all.
So basically,
Iridoplasty.
PI has no role in plateau iris syndrome because it is basically because of the anterior rotation of the ciliary processes. So it is actually a diagnosis which is done post-procedure, post-PI, plateau iris syndrome. Plateau iris configuration will definitely respond to a PI. Once a patent PI is there, there will be deepening of the chamber and there will be no rise in intraocular pressure. But as Sushil said, that even after a persistent patent PI, pressure is remaining high, then we have to suspect plateau iris syndrome, and it is a diagnosis which is done post-procedure. So in plateau iris configuration, iris will have a flat shape, unlike in plateau iris syndrome where there will be a peripheral forward bowing of the iris.
At the presentation, you might feel that this is a plateau iris syndrome, but you still do a PI because even a small component of pupillary block, if it is there,
yes,
that could be more problematic and damaging to the glaucoma process. So you do a PI, and if it is not responding, then you label it as a plateau iris syndrome or a configuration.
Yes. What will be the inference on indenting a clay surf? I think we already said that. Can prostaglandin be in fact detrimental in acute attack?
That I think we have addressed. Prostaglandin, wherein there is an inflammation in the first few days or a week, is avoidable. But if there is no other option, that the pressures are sky high, and for some reasons, if the PI or a surgical PI is not amenable, then you could add as a last resort.
Right.
And there is one
Yeah,
more.
you want?
If
Yeah.
miotics cause forward bowing of the lens complex, how can pilocarpine be used for the prophylaxis of pigment dispersion glaucoma?
That's only with a very long term use of a pilocarpine, which is known to have a pupillary block. This thing. It's not for a short term pupillary, and it is rare to show it now because you don't use it as it was being used in 80s and 90s, where pilocarpine and timolol were the only drugs to control the IOP.
So what is the ideal method to measure IOP in post-refractive surgery patients? I've already answered that. We don't have any reliable tool as of now. We can use dynamic contour tonometry, but still there is no gold standard way to check pressure in post-refractive surgery patients. Sushil, you want to add something?
Yeah, one only point is that if it's a new patient come to you with a post-refractive status with no previous data, then you have no other option but to start with the common things that are there with you, the Goldman applanation or the DCT. But the best thing is to always have the pre-operative data with the patient. What was the pre-operative IOP? What was the pre-operative pachymetry? That will give you an idea about the post-LASIK possibly corrected IOP. And that will help you in guiding the patient in the post-operative period. So in that scenario, if you have all the record with you, a Goldman applanation tonometry is also good enough for you.
Relationship of episcleral venous pressure to glaucoma.
Yeah, so the flow of aqueous, it goes from the trabecular meshwork to the Schlemm's canal and to the episcleral veins. So if the episcleral venous pressure increases, then it's a restriction of the flow from the trabecular meshwork outside, and that's why the pressure in the intraocular pressure increases. Commonly in these scenarios, you see a blood in the Schlemm's canal, and that is a sign of a rest episcleral pressure.
So clinically, how is target IOP calculated? I've answered in short. Calculation of target IOP is a very complex this thing. It depends on multiple factors. Age and severity of glaucoma is very important. Age of the patient and severity of glaucoma. So to broadly state it, I would say that if it's a mild glaucoma in an elderly patient, you should aim for a target IOP of 18 to 20. If it is moderate glaucoma, somewhere between 16 and 18. And if it is an advanced severe glaucoma, it will range between, it should be between in early teens, between 12 to 14. You would like to add something, because we cannot go in the details of this topic. Target IOP itself is a very extensive.
Yes, it is a big chapter.
Yes.
What you have said is exactly correct. Only one addition to is that even in a not very advanced field, but if you have the location of the field defect which is more central, you tend to treat it more aggressively, and you would like to label it, and the target pressures could be very
low. Why a new disc hemorrhage occurs adjacent to the old hemorrhage? So I have already said that it is the ischemic phenomena that is happening in the process, ganglion cells that is happening there. Any other reply to this question, Sushil? You would like to add something?
It depends on the arrangement. When you see the nerve fiber arrangement on the disc, it's typically the superior and the inferior, or rather the inferior and the superior poles, which are most vulnerable because of the arrangement of the nerve fibers. So because those areas are more vulnerable to the pressure damage and ischemia happening over there, the adjacent area to an existing or a resolved disc hemorrhage is the commonest area to have a new one. So that is why having a stereoscopic fundus photos are very important once you have a disc hemorrhage in the patient, because cursory examination might feel that, oh, this is the same which was there earlier, but it could be just an additional splinter disc hemorrhage which has happened just next to an existing one.
Yeah, that's very true. So when there is hemorrhage, it resolves. A few months later, you will see a classical wedge-shaped nerve fiber defect in the same area. So this is interesting. I don't know hot and cold signs of fundus in glaucoma, which was asked in Viva by one of the students. How do you
So,
define that hot and cold signs?
now this is a very subjective question. There's no objective answer to this, but what you can possibly take is hot is something which you are staring at. So you have a nerve, optic nerve head cupping. You have a retinal nerve fiber layer defect. This could be all the hot signs, or the vascular cupping, the bayoneting sign, and the lamellar dot signs. This could be the hot this thing. The smaller subtle changes like the disc hemorrhage or RNFL's splitting or very thin slit RNFLD, that you can consider probably as the soft changes which you could miss on the cursory examination.
Okay, why is pupil oval and mid dilated? I think we've already answered this because of sympathetic overstimulation and ischemia. Okay, intracameral anti-VEGF versus intravitreal anti-VEGF in NVG. What
I'll
would you
just
prefer?
add to that. So if you see the distribution of the vascular this thing, you have the ciliary vessels which and the nerves which you usually tend to avoid at the 3 and 9 o'clock. The blood supply on the nasal and the temporal side is much better than the superior and the inferior side. That's why the ischemia happens more over there, and that's why those part of the sphincter doesn't act. So it's the vertical elongation of the pupil which happens more commonly.
Right. Yeah, so next question is, what would you prefer, intracameral anti-VEGF versus intravitreal anti-VEGF in NVG? Should we do paracentesis along with intravitreal anti-VEGF in NVG or not, as it carries risk of hyphema? Suggest.
Intracameral anti-VEGF for NVG has not much of role, but if it is combined along with the intravitreal, and if you are doing an anterior segment procedure, yes, you can combine. But if you are treating the basic cause, which is either a PDR or a vascular occlusion or any other cause which is causing the NVG, the anti-VEGF dose needs to be given in the vitreous, which is the primary mode of action for the ischemia to decrease. By giving it in the anterior segment, what you're achieving is the short-term decrease in the neovascularization iris, which could be important if you're doing an anterior segment surgery, like if you're planning a trab or if you're doing implant. That's also not a very established modality of treatment, but there are reports of using it and having a good results. The second part of it is, would you prefer both? I answered that you could do both if the availability is there, especially if you're planning a procedure. Should we do paracentesis along with intravitreal anti-VEGF in NVG or not, as it carries risk of hyphema? No, a guarded paracentesis usually will not cause an hyphema. If you do a paracentesis and a sudden release or a sudden decrease of the intraocular pressure, then it can cause a hyphema. So you can do. The rough guide is post injecting the anti-VEGF. If you see that the digital pressure of the eye is high and you ask the patient to look at your face and identify the face and the features, if he is able to identify, that means the IOP increase in the eye is not much and you can avoid a paracentesis. But in the beginner's hand, always safer to do a paracentesis and avoid a serious complication.
Yeah, because you have written NVG, so these patients generally have high intraocular pressure, which is not responding to, and these are generally, they don't generally respond to medical line of management. So it is always safe and better to do a paracentesis in such patients. How to calculate IOP in relation to central corneal thickness?
So all the previous tables and all are more or less gone to dustbin now. You have a rough guide, and more so central corneal thickness now or pachymetry now has become an additional risk factor rather than an arithmetic addition to the correction factor. So the correction factor was used and was in a vogue a few years back, but now it is no more correction factor. It is just to tell you that a thin CCT person is at a higher risk of progression. So you take into account and try and have a little lower target pressure or more frequent monitoring. whereas a thicker CCT gives you a little comfort zone or a protective role.
Yeah, so roughly anything between 520 and 550 is what we see in normal individuals. Anything above 560 is considered to be a thick cornea, and anything below 500 becomes a thin cornea. So as he said, when it's a thin cornea, we have to be more aggressive. So algorithm that was used earlier, you may be asked in exam, is that for every thickness of 100 micron, you have to add 7 millimeter of mercury. Is it right? That was what we used to use,
Yes.
right, Sushil? Yeah.
Yes, yes. Typically 15 millimeter, 15 microns equate to around 1 millimeter
Yes.
of mercury. But yeah, now clinically it's not very important. But yes, as far as theory and as far as the Viva is concerned, that could be important.
Then it's one more last two questions only. Relationship of IOP and spontaneous venous pulsations.
Yes.
Yeah, see, spontaneous venous pulsations are quite often seen. It is very important in the question that we answered earlier in terms of an intravitreal injection or any procedure. If you are not able to see the normal pulsations of the central retinal artery, that's an indication that the IOP is too high and the vascular supply to the optic nerve head is compromised. So that could be a very good guide clinically. After giving an anti-VEGF, you should have a look on the slit lamp at the pulsations. If the pulsations are not seen, you could take measures to decrease the pressure. So the relation is that in a very high IOP, spontaneous pulsation could be decreased or could be lost. Anything to add, Dr. Chanda?
No, I think that is sufficient, right? So in fact, in normal tension glaucoma, we tend to look for the spontaneous venous pulsations. So as you mentioned that. Last question,
It's
Dr.
very
Sohail.
simple. The IOP and the intravascular pressures are balancing. So if the normal tension glaucoma, wherein the pressure of the eye is not very high, the venous pulsations are said to be little more larger and evident.
Yes,
Whereas in the normal tension, the high pressure glaucoma, the venous pulsation may not be so exaggerated.
Yes, very true. Yeah. So, Dr. Sohail, yeah, the last question is role of PG analogs in NTG. Definitely, that's the first line of treatment in normal tension glaucoma. In fact, beta blockers have no role in normal tension glaucoma and should be avoided in normal tension glaucoma. So, the first line of treatment in normal tension glaucoma is PG analogs. So, they have a very important role to play in normal tension glaucoma. Is that
Yeah, absolutely.
anything more?
Prostaglandins are the mainstay, and if at all that's not sufficient, you could add a brimonidine or a dorzolamide with a possible neuroprotective role. But as a first line, prostaglandin remains the mainstay.
Yes, very true. Yeah, unlike other glaucomas, beta blockers have no effect. In fact, they are contraindicated in normal tension glaucoma.
It is actually counterproductive. It could cause more early morning hypotension, and pressure could be compromised. It is counterproductive, so it should not be used.
I think we are done with all the questions.
Of even doing a systemic evaluation, if the patient is on a systemic beta blockers also, it's a point to be noted and referred back to the physician to take care of that.
Yes, true.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. That was very elaborative discussion, and I think we answered all the questions today. If they keep asking other questions, then I will be sending you privately. And thanks a lot, both of you, for your time and this discussion and explanation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
And thanks, Dr. Chanda.
With your permission, can I end the meeting, ma'am?
Yes.
Yes.
Please
thanks, Sumit.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Dr. Swapnish. Thanks, Sushil. Yeah.